Imagine a second grader, right?
Hmm.
And they're just violently flipping their desk in the middle of a math lesson.
Yeah, that's a pretty intense visual.
It is. And
Yeah.
to most of us, like standing in the back of that classroom, that just looks like a straightforward discipline problem.
Right, just a bad attitude.
Exactly. A kid who just needs, a strict timeout or something.
Right.
But to a behavioral psychologist, that desk flip is actually a desperate, highly specific form of communication.
Yes, it really is.
So today, we are taking a deep dive into a really fascinating stack of handwritten, meticulously detailed educational notes. They cover Module 9, Learners with Emotional Behavioral Disorder, or EBD for short.
It's a heavy topic, but a really important one.
Totally. And whether you are a teacher trying to manage a chaotic room, or maybe parent trying to decipher your child's struggles, or, just someone fascinated by how we systematically unpack human behavior, this deep dive is
Yep,
for you.
absolutely.
We are looking at the rigorous science of how professionals decode behavior, measure it, and basically build these proactive ecosystems to support kids who are truly struggling.
It is a profound shift in perspective, really, because when we just see a child acting out, we are only seeing the very tip of the iceberg.
Right.
These notes systematically walk us through the massive, complex reality operating underneath the water. We are moving entirely away from casual assumptions and jumping into a highly structured diagnostic landscape.
So to build that landscape, we really need to understand what an emotional behavioral disorder actually is.
Yeah, the definition is key here.
And looking at the source material, it's not a simple one-liner. The notes point out the federal definition, which comes from IDEA 2004, and that focuses heavily on duration.
Right, the time factor.
Exactly. It defines EBD as a condition exhibiting certain characteristics over a long period of time. But then, researchers, specifically Hallahan and colleagues back in 2014, they pushed back on that.
They did, yeah.
They identified several advantages to a proposed alternative definition. It seems like there's a real tug of war in how we even categorize this stuff.
That tension is actually central to the whole field. I mean, defining human behavior is notoriously difficult.
Oh, I bet.
The federal definition emphasizes that long period of time to ensure we aren't misdiagnosing a child who is simply having a difficult month due to a temporary life event.
Like a family move or a divorce, something like that.
Exactly. However, researchers advocate for alternative definitions to better capture the actual nuance of the disability. They want definitions that are clinically useful for getting a child immediate help, rather than just, serving as rigid bureaucratic checkboxes for federal funding.
Makes sense. And the characteristics of that disability, they're incredibly far-reaching. It's not just about emotional regulation, right? It impacts cognitive ability and academic performance, too.
Significantly, yes.
The notes indicate that learners with EBD frequently score average to below average on IQ tests, which directly translates into severe academic deficits.
Because it creates a brutal compounding effect for the student.
How so?
Well, if a child is constantly flooded with emotional distress, their cognitive load is completely maxed out. Think of it like a computer with its CPU running at 99% just to keep the operating system from crashing.
Oh, wow. That's a great way to picture it.
Right. They simply do not have the working memory or the bandwidth left to process a new math concept or decode a complex reading passage.
Yeah, there's just no room left.
Exactly. That leads to low achievement, which in turn reinforces their frustration and deepens the emotional distress. It is a very vicious cycle.
Which brings us to a piece of these notes that completely stopped me in my tracks.
Oh, the language piece.
Yes, there is a section specifically detailing language deficits. It states there is a clear and strong connection between behavioral problems and a child's ability to communicate.
That is perhaps the most crucial insight in this entire module.
Oh, really?
I think so. Historically, schools have often separated speech and language services from behavioral interventions, like they're two different lanes.
Right, you go to the speech therapist for one thing and the counselor for another.
Exactly. But these notes show they are intimately linked. If a child cannot effectively express what they are experiencing, their behavior fundamentally becomes their communication.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we look at how the notes categorize these problem behaviors, they fall into two primary buckets.
Right. Internalizing and externalizing.
Right. First, you have internalizing behaviors, which are negative actions directed inward, like crippling anxiety, which the notes defined as a profound feeling of distress.
Which is often silent.
Exactly.
Right.
Then you have externalizing behaviors. These are the easily observed outward actions like conduct disorder, which is characterized by consistent antisocial patterns.
The loud ones.
Yeah. So is internalizing behavior, like a heavy background app, silently draining a phone's battery? While externalizing behavior is the app visibly crashing on the screen for everyone to see.
What's fascinating here is how perfectly that analogy aligns with the language deficit connection.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because if a student lacks the vocabulary and the pragmatic language skills to articulate the complex, overwhelming reality of that draining battery.
Or they can't just say what's wrong.
Exactly. If they cannot verbally say to a teacher, I am feeling a profound sense of anxiety and my sensory system is overloaded right now, then the crashing app of externalized behavior becomes their primary language.
Wow. So flipping that desk.
Yes, flipping that desk, refusing to work, displaying antisocial patterns that becomes their most reliable, efficient way to scream for help or to escape a situation they simply cannot verbally navigate.
And naturally, the notes point out that these students face massive social skill deficits. They struggle to form and sustain connections with peers and adults, which, makes total sense.
It does.
If your battery is constantly dead or your app is aggressively crashing every time someone interacts with you, building a social network is going to be nearly impossible.
Precisely.
Okay.
And because internalizing behavior is so hidden and externalizing behavior is so easily dismissed by frustrated adults as just a bad attitude, we cannot rely on casual observation.
Right.
A teacher's subjective feeling that a kid is just, being difficult is not a diagnosis.
Which means we need a reliable system to filter out that subjective bias. Like, how do professionals actually know they're dealing with EBD and not just a kid pushing boundaries?
There's a very strict protocol for that.
Yeah, the notes outline 5 core principles of assessment and identification, and they seem heavily focused on creating a protective shield around the student.
Very much so.
They mandate active parental participation, so the family is central to the decision-making, and they require a multidisciplinary team approach.
So why is it so critical to have a whole team rather than just, trusting the teacher who spends the most time with the child?
Well, a single observer, even a highly dedicated teacher, has blind spots.
A multidisciplinary team intentionally brings different professional lenses to the same child. The speech pathologist might catch that subtle language deficit we just discussed.
Ah, right.
The school psychologist might identify the underlying internalizing anxiety. The general education teacher provides the data on academic deficits. You need the collective expertise of the whole team to see the whole child and prevent a single bias from driving the diagnosis.
That makes a lot of sense. And that multidisciplinary approach ties directly into the third principle, which is accurate and fair evaluation, ensuring all suspected disabilities are examined.
Crucial step.
Then there's confidentiality of results, keeping the data restricted to authorized personnel. Finally, the right to due process.
Which is huge.
Yeah. This gives parents a legal mechanism like mediation or a formal hearing if they fundamentally disagree with the school's findings. It really underscores how high the stakes are.
Absolutely. A special education label alters a child's entire educational trajectory. These principles exist to guarantee the process is rigorous, legally sound, and completely driven by the student's best interest.
And to actually execute that fair evaluation, the notes detail several specific screening tools.
Yeah.
But instead of just looking for problems, it seems modern tools are doing something different.
They are.
There's the CBCL, the Child Behavior Checklist, which detects emotional problems and sits within a larger empirical framework called a CEBA. But then the notes highlight the BEARS-3, the Behavioral and Emotional Rating Scale.
Yes.
This one evaluates the student by specifically looking at interpersonal strength and affective strength.
That inclusion of the BEARS-3 represents a massive, necessary shift in psychological assessment.
Really? How so?
Traditionally, assessments were entirely deficit-focused. They just provided a laundry list of what the child was doing wrong.
That sounds depressing.
It was. But the BEARS-3 actively measures a child's strengths. You have to know what a child is naturally good at, or what positive connections they already have, because those strengths become the foundational building blocks for their eventual intervention plan.
Oh, that's smart. Then there is the SSBD, the Systematic Screening for Behavioral Disorders. The notes describe this as a multiple gating or 3-stage system designed specifically for early grades, 1 through 5, to catch both internalizing and externalizing behaviors.
Yes, the 3 gates are very rigorous.
But let me play devil's advocate here for you, the listener. If a kid in 2nd grade is actively tearing up the classroom today, Doesn't a rigorous three-stage multiple gating system run the risk of creating bureaucratic delays?
That's a common concern, yeah.
Aren't we just stalling while the kid desperately needs help?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, those rigid structures, the multiple gates, the multidisciplinary reviews, they are the very things preventing lasting harm.
Harm from a misdiagnosis.
Exactly. Rushing an assessment to stop the immediate bleeding in the classroom might feel like the right thing to do in the moment. But if you rush, you risk applying a permanent, incorrect label.
Wow.
If you misdiagnose an internalizing anxiety disorder as a behavioral conduct disorder, you are going to prescribe the wrong interventions. That will actively worsen the child's emotional trajectory. Thoroughness must balance speed because an incorrect label is incredibly difficult to undo.
So you are essentially building a buffer against panic diagnosing.
Exactly.
But once a student successfully and fairly passes through those screening gates, the broad labels aren't enough to fix the day-to-day issues. Knowing a student has EBD doesn't explain why they flip a desk during math.
Right. The label's just the start.
The notes introduce something called FBA, Functional Behavioral Assessment. They cite O'Neill from 1997, defining it as the systematic collection of data on problematic behavior to actually comprehend it.
FBA is the gold standard in behavioral psychology. It is the critical transition from saying this student is disruptive to understanding the precise mechanics of the disruption.
Getting into the nuts and bolts.
Yes.
Yeah.
It answers the fundamental question, what purpose is this behavior serving for the child?
And they answer that question through direct observation. An expert physically goes into the natural setting, the classroom, the cafeteria, and tallies exactly what happens using 5 measurements of observation.
Which are very specific.
Very. And these are incredibly granular. You have frequency, which is how often it happens, duration, how long the behavior lasts, latency, the time that lapses between two situations, topography, the shape or form of the behavior, and magnitude, the intensity.
All critical data points.
Here's where it gets really interesting. To put this in perspective for the listener, is topography how a student exhibits distress, like hiding under a desk, versus pacing the back of the room, while magnitude is purely about the volume or physical intensity of that action.
Yes, that distinction is spot on. Topography is the physical shape of the behavior. It's what you would see if you were watching the student on a silent security camera.
Oh, a silent camera. I like that.
Right. So a student might express frustration by tapping a pencil. The topography is pencil tapping, but the magnitude is the force. It could be a soft, barely noticeable tap or a furious, paper-tearing slam.
And latency is equally fascinating to me. That's the gap between the trigger and the reaction.
Yes.
So if a teacher says, open your math books, and the student stares blankly for 35 seconds before throwing the book across the room,
Yeah.
that 45 seconds is the latency.
Exactly. And capturing that latency data fundamentally changes how a teacher responds.
How so?
Well, subjectively, a teacher might say, he threw the book for no reason, but the data shows a 45-second processing delay. That tells the multidisciplinary team the student might be experiencing a massive cognitive or language processing failure during that window.
So it wasn't out of nowhere.
Right. Those 5 measurements turn subjective annoyance into actionable scientific data.
But the observer doesn't just sit there with a stopwatch in every scenario. The notes contrast 3 different types of FBA.
Right, they're different approaches.
There is indirect FBA, where you collect information by interviewing parents or past teachers. Then there's descriptive FBA. This is where you directly observe the student in their natural environment and document the antecedents, the specific things that happen immediately before the behavior occurs.
Yes, observing the triggers.
But the third type is functional analysis. The notes specify that this entails actively manipulating those antecedents and subsequent events to test the target behavior.
This raises an important question because the practical difference between descriptive FBA and functional analysis is massive.
It sounds kind of risky.
It can be. With the descriptive FBA, the observer is essentially a fly on the wall. You are watching naturally occurring events like a transition from recess to reading and logging what happens.
Just taking notes.
Right. But with functional analysis, the clinical professional is actively engineering the environment. They might intentionally present a highly difficult task or systematically remove adult attention, specifically to trigger the desk flip or the outburst.
Wow, on purpose.
On purpose. They are essentially testing the boundaries of the crashing app in real time to prove definitively which line of code is causing the failure. It requires immense clinical expertise to do safely.
That is intense. You are intentionally triggering the behavior to prove its function.
Exactly.
But gathering all this granular data on frequency, topography, and function is ultimately useless if it just sits in a filing cabinet.
Yeah.
How do we move from diagnosis to actual treatment?
That's the most important part.
Yeah. The notes transition into educational approaches, heavily focusing on building better ecosystems. The foundational framework here is PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports.
Right, because data without intervention is just trivia. PBIS is the mechanism for reshaping the student's reality.
And what does that look like?
It is an evidence-based, multi-tiered framework designed to improve social, emotional, and academic outcomes for all students, not just those with EBD.
And it operates on a three-tiered system. Tier 1 is universal. These are the behavioral expectations and supports provided to everyone in the building.
Yep, the foundation.
Tier 2 is targeted support for students who need a little extra help. And Tier 3 is intensive, highly individualized intervention for students with the most significant needs. How does that actually play out in a school?
Think of the PBIS tiers like a public health model. Tier 1 is the clean drinking water and universal hand washing things like school-wide reward systems, clearly posted rules, and basic social emotional lessons that keep the general population healthy.
Makes sense.
But some kids will still catch a bug. That's Tier 2. This might look like a small group of 6 students meeting with a counselor twice a week to explicitly practice role-playing social interactions.
Okay, a bit more focused.
Right. But for a student with EBD who is actively flipping desks, they require Tier 3. That is the clinical intensive care unit. It requires highly specialized, individualized interventions based entirely on that rigorous FBA data we just discussed.
And for a student in Tier 3, the cornerstone of their intervention is a BIP, a Behavioral Intervention Plan.
Crucial document.
The notes define a BIP as a proactive strategy, detailing sequential actions to teach an alternative behavior that corresponds to the purpose of the problem behavior.
Oh.
That word proactive seems to do a lot of heavy lifting there.
It changes the entire paradigm. Historically, behavior plans were just escalating lists of punishments. If the student acts out, they lose recess. If they do it again, they get suspended.
Very reactive.
Exactly. But a modern BIP is a teaching document. If the functional assessment proves our student is flipping the desk specifically to escape overwhelming math work, punishing the behavior doesn't address the core deficit.
They still can't do the math.
Right. The BIP explicitly teaches an alternative behavior. We teach the student to use their words or hand the teacher a physical card that says, "I need a 3-minute break."
Oh, that's clever.
It is. That alternative behavior serves the exact same function, temporary escape from the math work, but it does so safely, calmly, and appropriately. You honor the child's need to communicate, but you change their vocabulary.
That is brilliant. And to support these plans, the notes list specific evidence-based classroom strategies.
Ooh.
First is teacher praise, which has been proven to convey powerful social approval.
It really works.
Then there's something called high rates of active student response, or ASR. This means creating learning scenarios that require students to actively respond continuously.
ASR is a fascinating mechanical tool for behavior management.
Really? How so?
Well, if a teacher lectures for 20 minutes and only calls on one student, the latency between engagement opportunities is massive. The students' minds wander, anxiety creeps in, and problem behaviors manifest.
Idle hands, basically.
Exactly. But if a teacher uses whiteboards and every single student has to write down an answer and hold it up every 2 minutes, you are drastically reducing the opportunity for off-task behavior. You are keeping the cognitive load focused entirely on the academic task.
The final classroom strategy listed is teaching self-management. The notes break this down into 4 key skills: self-monitoring, self-evaluation, self-reinforcement, and self-instruction.
The ultimate goal, really.
So what does this all mean? Let me ask you this. If a student is receiving these highly intensive Tier 3 interventions, is the ultimate goal of teaching them self-management to eventually equip them to navigate Tier 1 clean water just like everyone else?
Yes. That is the ultimate triumph of special education. We do not want a student to rely on a hovering adult to monitor their topography and duration forever.
That's not sustainable.
No, it isn't. We want to teach them to pause, internally evaluate their own emotional state, reinforce their own positive choices, and mentally instruct themselves through an anxiety-inducing moment. We are transferring the control from the environment back into the hands of the student.
And that philosophy is legally baked into their IEPs, their individualized education programs. The notes stress that IEPs must prioritize proactive strategies over reactive measures.
It's the law.
Yeah, they require periodic reevaluation to ensure the plan evolves as the student grows. There is even a mandate for transition planning for older students moving out of high school. Crucially, the notes emphasize that learners with EBD have the legal right to be placed in the least restrictive environment, or LRE, based on their assessments.
The least restrictive environment ensures we aren't just locking these kids away in isolated rooms. We want them learning alongside their general education peers as much as absolutely possible.
Integrating them.
Exactly. By utilizing proactive behavioral intervention plans and building those self-management skills, we are actively giving them the structural support they need to survive and thrive in that least restrictive setting.
It is an incredibly rigorous, systematic journey when you lay it all out. Just looking back at what we've unpacked today, we started by untangling the deep complexities of emotional behavioral disorders, realizing that internalizing distress and externalizing actions are often just a desperate language for kids who lack the words.
It's all communication.
We explored the strict, multidisciplinary rules and multiple gating screening tools designed to protect these learners from subjective bias and rushed judgments. We saw how professionals scientifically measure behavior, breaking it down into frequency, duration, latency, topography, and magnitude.
The science of it.
And finally, we explored how schools use that data to build tiered ecosystems, utilizing proactive behavioral intervention plans and active student responses to teach these kids how to ultimately manage themselves.
It is a framework built on the premise that no child is inherently broken, you know? They just lack the proper tools to navigate their environment.
Beautifully said.
But as we look at how much effort goes into decoding a student's behavior in a natural setting, it does leave us with a broader question to consider.
Oh, what's that?
Well, if we know that problem behavior is essentially a desperate form of communication from a child struggling to process the world, what is the normal, increasingly fast-paced, high-pressure behavior of our modern society silently communicating back to these kids before they ever even step foot inside a classroom?
Wow. That is a powerful lens to view the world through and definitely something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. As always, keep questioning the world around you and stay curious.